GPHA does try to keep up with legislation. They have a 1 week or week 1 summary, which says not a lot's happening so far. But they do actually on there have some, the first thing I've heard about as far as what they're kind of interested in this year. And I don't know that they actually have some legislation pending on this. It's going to be introduced later. But right now, and this is something we kind of talked about in class the other day, let's see how they refer to it. It's a PBM patient steering. That's the new term. PBM is something I know you've heard about, pharmacy benefit management. And basically, legislation, pharmacists in many states have had legislation trying to get a little more control on PBMs so that pharmacy has a little better deal as far as reimbursement for third parties. The patient steering is kind of what we talked about last time when we mentioned the tactics that some PBMs or third parties use to make patients feel like they need to get their medications either through their mail order pharmacies or through certain preferred pharmacies. And this session, the GPHA is interested in trying to get some legislation introduced, probably with the pharmacist legislators' help, to reduce this practice or to make it where, again, pharmacy is on a level playing field. Did we ever get Augusta on board there? Anybody at Augusta, let me know. They can hear us now? Okay, very good. Well, like I said, I've just been giving a little background information here, and we'll get into the main part of the class. But we are interested in kind of keeping up with what's going on in this legislative session, even if there's nothing specific to pharmacy this time, because there will be things interesting to pharmacy in future years. I do want you to have an idea of how that works and how you, as a practicing pharmacist, can get involved. Okay, so starting out, and this is some information that a friend of mine, a former student, who is now in the pharmaceutical industry, one of the large major companies. He gave me some clip notes on some things they talk about with their new recruits as far as the idea that innovator pharmaceutical companies, those that do the research, that bring these drugs to market, there's a reason, and they try to use this as to give it some credibility as far as why they charge so much for these new drugs because of the various things that are invested in that. And he started out with this tiered structure of saying there are thousands and thousands of possibly active drug entities. Now with computer-aided molecular design, all this stuff, they come up with things that they have these functional groups that they think might have pharmacological activity. And of course, what they have to do is kind of balance that off against the side effects and the negative effects of those drugs and that type of thing. So they literally test thousands of these drugs in various ways. Some of it's computer modeling, but some of them get to animal testing modes. And all of this can be done without having to register or get any of these products going with the FDA. Okay, so this is all done in-house, but it does cost a lot of money, and they are, this is how they make their money. So they're trying to invest that money in these research-driven areas in order to come up with those new drugs that'll be the blockbusters. Of those thousands they look at, there's hundreds that they might actually patent. They find some kind of activity, but not every one of those is going to go all the way to come on the market, but they want to protect that in case they might use some of it down the road. So again, they will patent hundreds of those, and then they'll actually select maybe 100 of those drugs out of those thousands to start with. It might be go to the next phase, which would be animal trials. Again, all of this is just done internally. Doesn't involve the FDA or the regulations we've talked about. But these are done before they even come up with an idea that a drug might be the next big thing that they're going to try to market. Then out of that thousands, it filters down to maybe 10 of those drugs actually make it into clinical trials. And now this is where you start getting involved in it, especially like when you're looking up your seminars and going through searches and things like that. You see all these thousands and thousands of clinical trials. Just think about how many tens of thousands of drugs were looked at to come up with those that make it into clinical trials. Again, it starts getting very expensive at this time to do these, take them to the next level. And then out of 10 of those that go to clinical trial, only one of them may make it to market. So again, they use this kind of as their argument of why a new drug that just comes out on the market as a brand name is so expensive compared to other things that might be on the market. How can it cost that much more to manufacture? It's not the manufacturing process largely that's factored into brand name pharmaceuticals. It's this research process that goes on. How much does that cost? As you can see, it's gone up geometrically over the years. The latest thing I'd seen in Forbes magazine talked about $4 billion is kind of just an average figure it costs to get a drug to market. So again, you start dividing that up among the number of patients that they can get that drug prescribed for. They have, whatever's left of that 20-year period to market it before it can be available generically, and they have to try to recoup that research money. And the idea there, and what they tell you, is they got to recoup that research money so they can come up with the next great drug, which might be something that you or somebody in your family needs. So again, that's how they sway it that way. I definitely try to be fair and balanced, as the old cliche goes on this, and represent both sides. We definitely know that sometimes as pharmacists we get very frustrated with the drug manufacturers, but we also know that if it weren't for them, we wouldn't have these new products available. So somewhere in between, you have to find a balance there. Okay, so getting to the legislation, or to the things that are controlled by the drug laws, the IND is the first abbreviation that we want to know about. That stands for Investigational New Drug Application. This is after the drug has been discovered, goes through those first several stages, the animal studies have been done, things like that. And now they say a decision has been made, they're going to attempt to get that drug approved for human use. Okay, so they're going to attempt to go through the process with the FDA. First thing they have to do is file an IND, Investigational New Drug Application. After they submit that with the FDA, and this is very important, the FDA has 30 days to decide whether they're going to approve or deny that. So this is a relatively fast process. It's going to be very important in a minute when we realize that the approval process has no limit. It could take years, literally, for that. But to at least get this first step underway, after they've decided that they're going to pursue clinical patient-based trials, the FDA will let them know in 30 days. This is kind of like an IRB, Investigation Review Board, looking at how they're going to do the studies and basically saying, yes, you can proceed with that, and we'll be waiting for your results to consider approving the drug. Then, and only then, can they start doing clinical trials, and by clinical trials, I'm implying to go on humans, okay? So they can't give this drug to the first person until they file it with the FDA, an IND, so they at least know this drug is being considered as part of the new drug. One of the things they have to do is get an IND exemption. This is usually part of the process of being granted an IND. And this goes back to that USA versus Sullivan, the guy over in Columbus providing the anti-infectives to the soldiers over there. All of this is based on how they apply the federal regulations on a state-by-state basis. Realize these are unapproved drug products. They've only allowed them to now start doing clinical trials, so it's actually illegal to distribute those. So they have to get this IND exemption so they can start sending it to different states where the clinical trials are going to actually be held in order to even do the studies. It definitely does not imply approval from the FDA. It just allows them to transport and send these materials to these clinical sites. And again, the safety and efficacy is something that's going to be studied through these clinical trials, so it definitely does not imply that it's safe or efficacious. Remember how important those were as far as the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and the Keep Off for Harris Act. That does have to be proven before the drug to be approved for sale in the U.S. I put this in here. It came up one year. There is they unfortunately use the same term of exemption for chemotherapy drugs. And as you know, I'm sure you studied chemotherapy, they have these abbreviations for mixtures or cocktails of chemotherapy agents that are used for certain types of cancer. And those change frequently as they're finding that cancer cells mutate, this type of thing. So in order to not have to change the indication, but to get this approved, they will do an exemption for an indication for chemotherapy agents unrelated to this IND. Okay, just don't get confused with that. I think somebody was doing a seminar, or y'all were covering it in another class, and the terms seemed to clash at one time. But the IND exemption specifically allows for this product that's going to be studied, go through these research trials, to be distributed to the various sites. Otherwise, it would be legal to ship those. Okay, I know y'all covered this in some other classes, so we're going to do it pretty quickly. These are kind of generalizations about the different phases of clinical trials. Many of you talk about this again in your seminars as far as the studies you look at and what phase trial it is. Realize that this is why that's important to emphasize that, because it does give people an idea of what the trial is actually trying to accomplish. A phase 1 trial, usually compared to the others, it's relatively small, maybe less than 100 patients. A key component here is that phase 1 trials involve administering the drug to normal, healthy adults. Okay? They are not even trying to see if this drug is actually going to have action in the area that they feel like it's going to down the road. They're just trying to make sure that it's safe to be administered to someone, whether they have the disease state or not. So these patients specifically have to be not the target group that we're actually going to be studying with that research pharmaceutical. It's to assess the safety, toxicology, a little bit about the other pharmacological effects it might have in the body. One of your favorite topics, pharmacokinetics. It helps them determine how frequently it might need to be given, or at what milligram dose it might need to be given to optimize blood levels and things like this. Again, going back to our scenario of how many drugs start the process and how many finish, only 1 out of 5 you can make it through the phase 1 trial. So if you're doing, you're looking up a drug that you're interested in talking about, and all you can find are phase 1 trials, probably not a real good indication that that drug is going to carry on into the marketplace. Phase 2 trials, a little bit larger, kind of Goldilocks thing. It starts out with a small group. This is a little larger group, probably over 100 patients per trial. These patients, this is the first time the drug is actually administered to humans that have the disease or condition. It might have been used in animal models and things like that back prior to the IND process. But now that we're going to be giving it to patients, it's only after it completes phase 1, and 1 out of 5 do that, into phase 2 before they're even administering it to a patient that has the disease. The key thing here is now efficacy kicks in. First thing was safety, back to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Second thing is efficacy, the Harris-Kefauver Act. Again, realize until the 60s, this wasn't even required. This was an optional step. And many drugs were marketed that were proven safe, but never did have to prove their efficacy. They still do the kinetics and the dose range, things that they need to adjust as far as thinking ahead even to the manufacturing process. What's the best way to package this drug? What strengths do we need to offer? Is it a delayed release formulation or immediate release, things like that. They continue to assess safety. That doesn't go away, but this is where they add the efficacy in there. Phase 3 studies, and again, now it's building momentum. It's very likely these drugs are going to make the push to try to be approved for the market. This would be where, again, all else being equal, you would have much larger studies, possibly thousands of patients. Not always the case, but ideally the case. Widespread study groups, with this I mean patient demographics. Some of you talk about in your seminars that these studies are done largely in a foreign country only, and look at that as a limitation, or that they don't cover racial diversity. A drug that is used and it would be used in a wide range of people. So again, they try to look at as widespread group as possible, and you have to, when they end up with a phase 3 trial that doesn't have all those things taken into consideration, you got to think, what are the reasons? And realizing that that would be the ideal thing to do, well, maybe they found that it wasn't as effective in other groups. And some of these can be reasons, again, to look at it critically, things you learn about in your drug information class, to say, why didn't they do that? Or did they do that and that just never got published, or never went any further? Ideally, these will be double-blind studies. That's the easiest thing to do, so that you can really show that the drug does have an effect. But again, they're not always doing double-blind studies, and you got to ask yourself, why is that? Sometimes it's impossible to completely blind the type of test, so again, this is not an absolute requirement. But if a drug company was kind of sketching out what would be the ideal thing to do to prove that this drug was efficacious, they would be trying to do double-blind studies and showing that the drug had a very high effectiveness ratio. And of course, that double-blind study is drug versus a placebo. They'll end up doing a comparison of 2 drugs and have a non-inferiority and various things like that. But the ideal thing is to show that this drug stands on its own as an effective drug. They will involve various types of research faculty, clinical trial specialists. This includes a career opportunity for pharmacists. It hasn't always been the case, but especially as pharmacists have gotten more and more clinical background, this is a specialty practice area that many pharmacists now pursue as a career opportunity, and work for a pharmaceutical company or work for an independent research company that kind of pays the pharmaceutical companies pay as they go to get these people to do their research and do the meticulous record keeping and things like this. This is where the things that make us good pharmacists come in very handy, where we have to keep up with a lot of records. And again, the FDA is going to be looking over their shoulder, making sure that no steps were skipped. And pharmacists, it's been found, are very good at doing that. So it's not just physicians and nurses, but pharmacists get involved in that as well. By far, this is the most costly part, and it can take a lot of time. It can take years just to get the phase 3 clinical trials together. Again, there's a lot of money going into that, so it's very important that they're done correctly, that they stick with the protocols that they've developed, because the FDA is going to be looking at that once they submit it for approval. And if they find that one of your sites took a shortcut here or forgot this one step, they just throw out all those results. So again, all that money would be wasted. So it's very important to have somebody that's in charge of this and following it all through the process. Now, along the way, some other things can happen, and here's where we get into more of an alphabet soup. We'll talk about different types of INDs. A treatment IND, the kind of textbook case of when this happens, is when somebody's doing a study that's taking many years, but they're really seeing some pretty incredible results showing that this drug is effective in treating a disease which maybe doesn't have a lot of good options or is a new entity. So they will actually apply to the FDA for what's called a treatment IND, which allows them to use a non-approved drug in treating patients. Again, if they can get it approved faster, that might not be necessary, but this comes up in certain types of cases. One thing that's required there is the patient has to not be enrolled in the clinical trial. If they have patients that are taking the drug as a treatment IND, they have to be taken out of the clinical trial. So again, the company has to kind of weigh the advantages and disadvantages of that. If they're really showing positive results, they can't also use that as part of their phase 3 trial. They have to kind of have a separate group of patients, and they have to keep some people in the trial in order to get the drug approved. Some examples of when this might be used is when you have an imminent life-threatening situation, and again, you have to wait 6 months to get this drug approved. You're going to lose a lot of patients. So these would be reasons for that to happen. Current therapy is not effective, or this was much more effective and much safer. Some examples of when this has happened in the past, probably most recently, was in the 70s and 80s, when there were very few alternatives for treatment of AIDS. And as those products, antiretroviral products, started being used, and all the various ones that you have studied and know about, they would get approval for treatment INDs and actually use those drugs before they made it to market. Alzheimer's is an area where there's a lot of emphasis right now. There are very few, as you know, good alternatives for that. There had been quite a bit of promise a couple of years ago, and many of the companies, several companies, were really excited. Their stock was going up and all this because they had drugs that they thought were going to be helpful for Alzheimer's. Unfortunately, that has not proven to be quite as great as they expected. But again, hopefully there's going to be some breakthroughs there. That's definitely an area where many drug companies are doing research, but just because they just can't find the clinical connection. They can actually reduce the formation of the Lewy bodies and things like that, but it hasn't shown long term to really make a difference in the progression of Alzheimer's disease. Okay, so after they get it through the phase 1, 2, and 3 trials, the next step is the NDA process. We've already talked about NDA a little bit, and like I say, we'll talk about a number of different types of NDAs. But after they do that, phase 3 trials are complete. Again, going back to our stair-step thing there, 90% of them never make it out of phase 3. So the company's pretty excited that they're going to have something they're going to apply to the FDA. They call it a new drug application. They send these things. They used to have pictures of semi-tractor trailer trucks, delivering the stacks and stacks of research documents and things like that to the FDA. Of course, it's all done electronically now. But again, it represents a lot of data and a lot of things that the FDA has to go through to make sure that in fact the safety and efficacy is proven through these studies. So the problem there is the review process is not limited to 30 days. It never happens in just 30 days. It can take years and years for that process to happen. And that's where we got to talking about the patent restoration and the need to extend those beyond that minimum amount so the companies could get their money back out of it. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the process. They have come up with a way of allowing a company to get enhanced consideration or basically get more FDA people assigned to reviewing that product, and that's by paying a fee. Now, this all sounds good, and again, drug companies make a lot of money, right? But there are all different sizes of drug companies. So some of the smaller drug companies may not be able to pay the millions, literally, that the big ones will pay the FDA, not to approve the drug, but to improve the process of reviewing the drug. At least that's the premise there. You're not paying the FDA to approve your product, but you're paying to get some priority given to that product so it can be reviewed quicker, with the idea that that's an investment in your money that you're paying for these enhanced reviewers because you're going to get the product approved earlier and start making money on it. But again, that is one of the big holdups as far as the length of time it takes to get a drug through the NDA application process. Even though they've already spent years doing the investigations, the FDA has to review all that and determine whether the product's going to be allowed to enter the market. Okay, in the NDA process, again, why they had these semi-tractor trailer trucks full of literature is because it's not only the drug studies, all the data that was collected and who collected it and the monitoring they did to make sure that all of that was done consistently, but also labeling. And we'll spend quite a bit of time talking about labeling. I think it's kind of the first time, except for the fact that we said that it now required labels to have things like directions on them for over-the-counter products. But this has to do with the labeling of prescription drug products, and realize that is part of the process that the FDA goes through as far as approving the drug. They don't just come up with a label that looks like the company logo and put all the things on there they want to have. It's very specific as far as what the FDA requires on that, and that is part of the approval process. It can hold up the approval process if they have to go back and forth on that. The code word that the FDA uses, and if we could look at that Federal Register, which is not being published right now because of the partial government shutdown, we would see new drugs listed there that have been successfully approved by the FDA, and it would be listed as they were put on file. So on file means they go in another book, which means those products can now be marketed. But that's what the official FDA title is for that process. Putting the drug on file means that they can now start making the drug available by the new drug application sponsor. Realize that they're the only ones that can make it, and it's still, privileged company information and things like that at this time. Okay, so the drug made to market. There we go. We're back. Okay, a couple of other things that can happen along the way. We mentioned one way that the company can actually pay some money to get more reviewers working more time on a particular drug, but also there is a status called the fast track drug, and the company's request to the Health and Human Services Secretary that their drug, after they've seen the phase 3 trials, they can say, look, we'd really like to request that you ask the FDA to make this a fast track drug. And again, some of the same reasons come into play. If that drug has been found successful in treating serious or life-threatening diseases, unmet medical needs, maybe one that there aren't many other products, or the products that are available are very toxic. This one shows a lot better safety profile. So all those kind of things can grant this fast-track approval process. The good thing about the fast-track approval process is it doesn't require the company to pay more money. Okay? So again, if you've got a company that's a smaller company or just a research-based company that doesn't have all the marketing money to put in to get the review process sped up, if they have a drug that meets these categories, they could request it be a fast-track drug, and that does, again, kick in the FDA reviewing the process more quickly. Okay, now we'll start with the various types of NDAs. We mentioned this one before, abbreviated new drug application. This one came along with the Waxman-Hatch amendment, specifically for generic drugs. What that said was that all they had to do was prove that the drug was equivalent by showing the bioavailability, chemical, pharmacological activity. They didn't have to go back and do all the phase 1, 2, and 3 studies. Before that time, 84, if a company said, look, this drug's off patent, we would like to compete with the people selling it as a brand product and sell it cheaper as a generic, they still had to go back through the phase 1, 2, and 3 trials. So it just wasn't as economically feasible. You had to do the same studies again to offer the drug as a generic product. So this is really where the beginning of the generic drug market came from. Again, much less expensive submission. Instead of a tractor-trailer truck, they could probably get the documents you want a pickup truck or something like that. But it's just speeds the process along. And again, the incentive here is to provide a lower cost drug, hopefully reduce healthcare costs. Another one is called the Supplemental New Drug Application, or SNDA. This is also used for drugs that are already in the market, but it would be done by the company who's actually marketing them. This means that they're going to make some change, or the most frequent thing is that they want to add another approved indication. I know y'all spend a lot of time talking about indications for new drugs and then off-label uses. We're going to talk a little bit about that, but it's still, many prescribers are hesitant or resistant to use it for an off-label use without it being proven safe and efficacious. So this is a way for that company to go back, not have to start from scratch, but add some more research data, maybe finding a new dosage or a new dosage form, maybe a long-acting version. It's the same drug, but it's they have to get it approved because it is different from the previously approved product. So they could do a supplemental new drug application to add that information without having to go through a whole NDA process. Okay. That's the good news. The bad news is, again, the dosage form and strength. There have been several drugs. I think the Certa was one relatively recently, but I'm sure you see some of these drugs where they've had, very even dosage forms, 25, 50 milligrams, things like that. And all of a sudden they come out with a 27 milligram strength and a 54 milligram strength. Why did they do that? Well, they did it as a supplemental new drug application, and they allegedly, or they should have had some clinical data that showed some benefit to those slight changes. But what it also did was reset the clock on the patent. So again, it prevents or slows down the entry of generics into the market. A lot of times you'll see that that's done right before a drug goes off patent. And all of a sudden, the brand manufacturer comes up with a slightly different strength, or they change it to a different type of release mechanism, and that starts the patent clock again. And even though the generic companies can now make the old product, well, if they're successful in marketing and changing everybody this new dosage form, it really throws a monkey wrench in that. So again, it can be used as a tactic to delay the entry of generics to the market. Okay, a little bit more about the government regulations, and this gets pretty specific. I'm not going to ask you these things on the exam, but I just want to show you a little bit about how complex this process could be and all the things you have to get into if you're going into the regulatory area, all the different things you have to consider as far as how you even go through the new drug application process. While it's in the new drug application process, they classify it by therapeutic classification, and there's a lot of different ones of these. If you have the book, you can see a bunch of the others. I thought these were the only two that were significant enough for us to even mention. Just to give you an idea of what these things mean, there is a type P, and this is for the new drug application process, and I just said think P for priority. Again, if a drug shows a major therapeutic gain, or is a totally new drug class, or again is one of the best options where their other treatment options have not been so good, they might classify it as it goes through the NDA process. The FDA would classify it as a type P. Again, that's just like paying a little bit more to get more people reviewing it or giving it priority or fast track. This is priority consideration, and those drugs, they're going to assign their best people or their largest groups or whatever to get those drugs on the market sooner. There's all different levels. Type S, which is one I pulled out, was pretty far down the list. I think it's kind of standard. These are often referred to as Me-Too drugs. It's like, yeah, they've got some studies that shows non-inferiority. But do we really need this? Is it really something that's going to make a big difference out of the market? Well, the drug company thinks so. They want to sell it. They're going to have their marketing people convincing prescribers to use it. But it's not going to get as much consideration or as much action by the FDA because it's not going to make as big a difference in the actual clinical environment. So they do make some internal decisions there as far as which ones they really pursue versus others that might not be a big deal. And even more things, they'll have chemical classifications. If for some reason they decide to use numbers of these, and there's from 1 to 6, and that kind of tells you how much different this product is chemically than other products that are already on the market. New molecules get type 1, and those probably get a little more consideration because this is going to be a significant difference in the marketplace. Whereas type 6 are ones where they just change a couple of functional groups, or in the case of Nexium and Prilosec, back when they came on the market, one is actually the enantiomer mix, and one is just either the positive or negative or trans or cis, and it's the same drug. And they came out with it as a new drug, did a lot of marketing, and basically that was totally done to reduce the effectiveness of generics in the market. They did introduce the generics in the market, but they also had a new product, Nexium I think was the later one to the market, that they were able to market for many years as brand name only, and nobody wanted that old Prilosec generic because now there was this new Nexium. It's the same drug. So it was really a marketing decision strategy to try to keep their market share. And other classifications come up just based on what type of disease state. There was one, again, the priority given to the anti-AIDS compounds. Back when they were first coming on the market, they were actually given classification AA. So they really got a lot of consideration by the FDA trying to get them through into the market, excuse me, as quick as possible. Type E, for some reason, happens to mean it treats a life-threatening disease. So again, that's higher than a lot of things. But the next one down, type F, means it kind of flunked or failed. It's basically on hold. They're not really acting on that. A couple others, just for reference, is type N. There are drugs that go directly to the OTC market. Most drugs that are currently available, or many drugs that are currently available as OTC, started out as a prescription-only drug, went through this process, and then had to go through a process of getting converted to an OTC. A lot of the nasal steroids and things like that have been relatively recent, moved from prescription-only to OTC as an example of that. That's one way that a drug can become OTC. It can go through this NDA process, start out as a prescription-only medication, and then be converted over to OTC. The other way is a lot easier. Again, it's called an OTC monograph. And if you think monograph, and I asked y'all the other day, y'all had looked at the NDC or USP, US Pharmacopoeia, it lists monographs of drugs that are currently accepted as standard pharmaceutical medications. Not the new things that are just getting approved, but kind of the old standard products, older drugs, ingredients in drugs, things that are used as excipients or fillers. The OTC monograph, say if you're out in practice and we had a student a few years ago, he'd been working for pharmaceutical industry for many years. He got together with some of his other buddies in pharmaceutical industry, and they decided to start their own drug company. And the easiest way to do that, the way they started out, was saying we're going to offer our own line of over-the-counter medications. The reason that's easier is because you can go to this book of monographs, the USP or other official text that lists these drugs that are considered approved products, and you can kind of pick and choose those. Say if you want to make a cold remedy, you can go to the chapter on antihistamines and pull an antihistamine out of the USP, and you can go to a decongestant and pull that out of the USP. And you can make up your own recipe and market that as an over-the-counter medication because all those individual products have been approved. So they started out with that. They actually have a few prescription-only drugs now, but that's how they got their company started, by using this other mechanism, not even going through the FDA, and that's called an OTC monograph. That's something that's not in the notes, but you might want to write that down, the other way that a drug becomes an over-the-counter medication. Type B, for some reason, is an orphan drug. We talked about Orphan drugs, again, those that have a relatively small market as far as number of patients that might be candidates for that drug. Again, the federal government tries to give incentives, as we talked about, to get these orphan drugs to market. They're drugs that otherwise wouldn't make sense economically. Okay, there's not going to be a big enough market for them to get them, through this whole process. So they give them some incentives to get those orphan drugs to the market. We talked about how the magic number there is 200,000 people. It sounds like a pretty good number of people, but many of these orphan drugs are actually have targets much less than 200,000, maybe in the thousands or even hundreds of patients. So going through this whole process, it is probably not going to be worth the cost to get those products through the traditional process because they're not going to make enough money through the sales. We talked about the Orphan Drug Act of 1983 and the tactics they used, tax incentives, to give those companies some tax benefits so they would benefit more from the actual selling price of the drug rather than paying so much of it in taxes. And they would extend their exclusive marketing rights. This was some of that patent restoration process, so that no matter how long it took to get through the FDA, they would add some time back to it. Ideally, they would add all the time back to it that it took to go through the FDA approval process, but they had to have some limit. The maximum there was 7 years. Hopefully, most drugs don't take 7 years to get through the FDA process. And also to give them, through that classification, faster review, more reviewers assigned to that product, things like that, to try to get those drugs available. Okay, other things to think about as a new drug is being formulated and comes to market. You ever wonder where these drug names come from? And there's several different levels of drug names. Kind of an internal name is usually used in the animal studies, and it can be kind of a code name. This particular one, a lot of times it'll be some abbreviation of the drug company name. This one was Bristol Myers Squibb 2000, some drug that they were studying. Pre-IND, the company kind of gets to make that up themselves. Okay? And you may not even know what that name is. Some of the phase 1 studies may still have that in abbreviations or whatever. You might know what that name was. But the most important step is when it comes to getting that generic name. And again, as complex as some of those names get to be now, you might think somebody's just making them up with a random letter generator, but they're really not. There's actually a federal agency called the U.S. Adopted Names Council. I'm not sure if they're being affected by the shutdown or not. Probably they are, as the FDA is. But they are charged with the responsibility of giving these drugs simple, informative, non-proprietary names. Now, each of those kind of stands on its own. Ideally, it would be simple. Again, as I know many of you, again, keep talking about your seminars, but when you have to practice saying all those names, especially if you're doing a monoclonal antibody, I'm not so sure how simple all these things are, except for that little suffix on there that lets you know it's a monoclonal antibody. Informative, and again, a lot of drugs may have some portion of their name that relates to their chemical activity or whatever. It's really convenient, much easier back in the old days when more drugs had that in there. You can kind of see a new drug name and kind of figure out the class right away. You might be able to do that with some drugs today, but not always. Some of them just really go very different from what their chemical names would be. And then the idea of it being non-proprietary, they don't want it to be associated with a particular manufacturer. Okay? The whole idea of a generic name is that it's generic. It doesn't identify the manufacturer, and it allows this to be more easily marketed once it does become a generic product. The U.S. Adopted Names Council is a federal agency, but they do get input. They do check these names out with the American Medical Association, American Pharmacy Association, believe it or not, and then that group that writes the U.S. Pharmacopoeia. So they do have input and position at the table there with the U.S. Adopted Names for coming up with these generic names. So there is a method to the madness there, even though, like I say, sometimes it looks like they're just making these things up, like cramming a bunch of letters in them. The brand name or trade name definitely is established by the manufacturer. Again, they might have something in there that indicates or makes you think, oh, that's got to be such and such a drug company's name. But more likely, they try to make it where it doesn't have any negative connotations for the prescriber or the patients, but also maybe has something to do to kind of trigger the idea of what that drug might be used for. And of course, this has to be traded off. Again, this is part of the process of that new drug application. The company submits that along with their labeling information of what they're going to call the drug. But they can't go out there like with the next great antibiotic and call it Godzilla or something like that, although that would give people the idea that it's going to kill everything out on the market. But they do have to be responsible with that. The FDA does have to approve that. They do market surveys. There's a whole independent industry of marketing people that work on drug names to, again, try to make it sound as positive as possible without overextending that and making false claims or implying false claims, but also making sure that it doesn't have any negative connotation. Also, there's some consideration giving to sound alike or look alike drugs, trying to make sure that there's less chance for drug errors rather than just using a name that's very similar to something else that's already on the market might be used for a totally different disease. I put this particular company in here. This is something that I got tied into a number of years ago at a APHA meeting. You go to these conventions, and sometimes they offer you, say, hey, you got 30 minutes or something, we'll give you a $50 gift certificate or buy you dinner at this restaurant or something like that. The Brand Institute is one of these companies that actually works on a contract basis with the manufacturers to help survey what would be the best name for a drug. And so they call themselves Brand Institute. I actually spent the 30 minutes or so. I think I got $50. It might have been 100. I don't know. I thought, hey, this is cool. But of course, they get all your information. Well, I started getting emails from them. And for years now, I 2 or 3 times a year will get a survey from them, and they will pay you to go through the survey as a practitioner, and you will listen to, sometimes it's a audio file, if you listen to these different drug names, or you hear somebody calling in a prescription, and they ask you to tell them what that sounded like to you, things like that. Again, they're trying to make sure these drug names are going to be useful, but also not be confusing. And so if you get some time, Google Brand Institute, and you might want to sign up and see if you can get on the list to do some of those surveys down the road. But realize that is something, and they have all different types of medical professionals, prescribers as well as pharmacists that are going to be affected by these different drug names. So they're actually in the business of helping these companies come up with the best possible names. Okay, so we've talked about before, but again, very important, the Waxman-Hatch patent protection. This was the thing that developed to allow us to have generic drugs. We talked about the original patent protection of being 20 years or so, depending on the product, but mostly for drugs, it's a 20-year protection. We talked about this long process of getting a drug, even to the IND process, and how it has to go through phase 1, 2, and 3 trials. It can eat up a lot of that 20 years. Okay? So, again, Waxman-Hatch, although we think of the main thing it did was opening up the generic drug industry, realized they had to offer something to the brand manufacturers, or their lobbyists were working night and day trying to prevent this kind of regulation from passing. So it's a compromise, just like all legislation is. And so they had to put something in there for the innovator companies or the brand manufacturers, and also the main intent, which was to encourage generic marketing of generic drugs. So it's called the Patent Restoration and Drug Price Competition Act. The patent term restoration was part in there for the brand manufacturers, and drug price competition was for the generic manufacturers. So there always has to be balance in that. Some of the specifics on that, initially it was up to 5 years could be added. Remember we said 7 years could be added for orphan drugs, but it just to give the incentive for these companies to keep doing the research. They would say, we'll guarantee you at least 5 years on top of the time you have remaining after we approve this product to market it as a sole source product before the generics can come in there and try to get their money out of it. So ideally, where that 5 years came from, it wasn't done just to say, oh, we're going to give you 5 years. We'll give you up to 5 years, depending on how much time it takes for the FDA to approve the drug. Okay? So the FDA, if this particular product takes 3 years, as part of this act, they could actually get those 3 years back completely and still have that time to market the drug. But it was only the FDA approval process. It didn't go back to the amount of time it took them to do the phase 1, 2, and 3 studies or all the back time that they would have done before they went through the IND process. Like I say, the Waxman-Hatch has given birth to the generic drug industry in the U.S., definitely has affected pharmacy greatly. It wouldn't be the job you're doing now, whether it's community or hospital practice, if it wasn't for generic drugs. The key thing there was the development of the ANDA, abbreviated new drug application, to reduce the need for those phase 1, 2, and 3 studies. We talked about the incentives it gave to the brand manufacturers, basically that extension or restoration of some of the years on the patent. One of the things it did for generic companies, in order to encourage them to pursue this and be the first one, is what's called a 180-day exclusivity. So again, we talked about this last class, I believe. We said that's the reason when you have a brand manufacturer drug that goes off patent, and that first generic company comes up there, and you start getting that from your wholesaler, you check the price, and it's cheaper, but it's not a whole lot cheaper. And usually that will last, if you watch it, it's going to last for about 6 months. If the third parties are paying for it, the patient wants to buy the cheaper drug, they can definitely save some money, but only once all the other generic manufacturers enter into the process does the price really drop down to what the actual pricing of it would be on a generic basis. The other things that have complicated this are things that were in the Act, again, so that it would be passed, but the brand name drug companies have used this and to some extent maybe overused this. We talked about the 30-month stay. First time a company challenges a patent, says we want to file an ANDA with the FDA, the brand manufacturer can say, wait a minute, we've got to assemble our legal team and see if what they're saying is actually true, if our patent has actually expired. So just by requesting that, they immediately get a 2.5-year delay in getting that drug to market. So the generic companies have to factor that in to their process of deciding whether this is going to be generic or not. Another thing they did, which was not part of the Waxman-Hatch, but it's something they kind of extrapolated from that, is something called authorized generics. And this is what's happening when you get that first generic non-branded bottle of the drug, and you pour it out into the tray to count it there, and you look at it and say, wait a minute, it's got the company name on it, it's exactly the same product as your brand product over here. What's going on with that? Well, that's called an authorized generic. Basically, the brand manufacturer, in order to take the incentive out of the generic companies from competing with them against their product, they have their own company, a generic company, and they authorize that company to get the ANDA approved and start offering that product. They don't even change the line where they're manufacturing that product. It's still done on the same equipment, keeps them from having to go through any good manufacturing practices approval or anything like that. It's the same product that the brand manufacturer was. So again, you might say, what's in it for them on that? Basically what they're trying to do is make it not as good for a generic company. You're not going to make as much money on it because the brand manufacturer is going to actually jump in and start offering a generic before the other companies can do it. So they're trying to, it's a disincentive for them to pursue the generic approval process. Even though it's a lot cheaper, it's not without a significant cost to become a manufacturer. I've added this article in that might be relevant section. Again, I'm not going to test you in that material, but if you're interested in that, if you have an interest in the pharmaceutical industry and how they do business, it can be appearing a little sketchy sometimes. You might want to read this article. It was done 23 years after the 1984 Act, so itself is pretty old now, but it talks about the history of how the companies came up with these different strategies once the Waxman-Hatch Act came out, to find a way to kind of go around the intent of the Waxman-Hatch and to try to reduce the ability of generics to enter the market. We did talk a little bit more about how Medicare Part D, the Medicare Modernization Act, reduced that 30-month stays to only one time. And that was a big deal because, again, what the companies would do, they would do a 30-month stay, and then about the time their months were up, their 2.5 years, they would say, oh, wait a minute, we have another consideration. They would apply for another 30-month stay. So they could effectively put off the approval of a generic drug for many years, 5 years or more, if they get multiple 30-month stays. So a lot of lawyers working for pharmaceutical companies were coming up with these different ways of trying to do that. But again, the Medicare Modernization Act said you got one 30-month stay only, and took that out of the market. And this is just a cartoon from that time showing the drug company that comes in to the FDA over here and says, oh, we got this great new product. And instead of the goose, it's the moose tying on some antlers there. So again, that's those Me Too drugs, and they're really doing that not as a significant new product in the clinical practice, but they're doing it for money. And again, is that a bad thing? Not necessarily so. They are trying to, satisfy their shareholders and keep their research going so they can develop that next great new drug, which might be exactly the drug you're going to need to extend your life. So there's no complete bad guys or complete good guys in this. As usual, it's a little bit of both. So you just have to kind of read between the lines and see all of that. And I kind of hit all these editorial comments. I just put that in there to show you that that's not, official, that's not law, but the things that I want you to think about as far as how these drugs come to market and how the competition for drugs getting into the generic market really play out. There have been some good things definitely about this. Remember, we said they gave some patent extension if a company would do pediatric studies. Largely, drugs aren't studied in the pediatric population. And this is provided for some increase in those studies. Definitely, there are orphan drugs on the market that would not have been here if these other aspects had not been put into the legislation for Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. But there's also been a lot of products that offer no additional therapeutic benefit, Me Too products, that you end up spending a lot of time talking to your patients about, or they spend a lot of time at night watching the TV commercials in between the lawyer commercials about these new products, the latest, greatest thing that they're going to go in and ask their prescriber to provide for them, when it may be insignificant as far as the difference in the currently available product, which almost always is available at a much lesser price. Okay? Other things that are important in the drug development process, believe it or not, the NDC number has a process of being allocated to those drugs, again, for obvious reasons, to make sure there's not duplication. I think any of you that have worked in community practice, the NDC number has become something we use a whole lot because that's the way we identify a drug that we submit for third-party payment. It is an important product, or an important thing to keep up with that. Realize it is considered insurance fraud to submit the same drug product from a different NDC in order to get it to go through the third-party plan. Anybody ever seen that happen? Probably so. And again, they're not necessarily out there trying to chase every one of those down, but that's where we end up getting these drug audits sent to us. We have to go back in there and actually end up losing reimbursement for a particular drug product because we actually didn't have that NDC number in stock at the time, and we're billing a drug company for it. Taken to the extreme, it's insurance fraud and fines, prison sentences, loss of your ability to practice pharmacy. All those things can come into play. So NDC number, very important, just to have an idea of what the components mean. The first 5 digits may be abbreviated if the leading zeros can be dropped off of there, but the first 5 digits are the manufacturer. The middle 4 digits identify that particular drug from that manufacturer, and then the last 2 digits identify the package size. And no, they won't lock you up for insurance fraud for dispensing different package sizes. But again, the whole idea of using the NDC number as a way of identifying the product that you're submitting for, since it is going to, in most cases, a federally, a third party that provides funding from federal sources, it is a big deal. You need to keep up with that. There is a National Drug Code Directory. There's an FDA website. That one still works. Again, I don't know that they've added any new drugs to it since the government shut down, but it is maintained online, so you can check for other drugs, or if you can't get a particular brand of a generic drug, you can look on this and find other sources, other companies that produce the same drug using the NDC website. We talked about GMP before, good manufacturing practices. This is very important. It's actually part of the approval process. Doesn't necessarily factor into the phase 1, 2, and 3 trials. But the good manufacturing practices give a very detailed explanation of the components, what goes into a drug, how it's manufactured, how those drugs are stored, where they're sourced from. If they're temperature sensitive, you have to have some way of indicating that they've been stored within their appropriate temperatures, all those things. As I mentioned before, it may also be CGMP, and usually it's a small c on that, but either small or large, that just means current good manufacturing practices. All the manufacturers are regulated, they have to be registered, and they're inspected by the FDA. This is kind of analogous to our pharmacies. They're regulated, inspected by the state boards of pharmacy, or in our case, the Georgia Drugs and Narcotics Agents. I realize the manufacturers are regulated. We'll actually talk about how states also regulate this, and in Georgia there is a manufacturing permit that you have to have in order to be a manufacturer. In addition to complying with all the FDA regulations, you have to be registered in the state of Georgia, and there are specific requirements as far as you submitting products for analysis and things like that. Again, GMP has to do with the ingredients, lot numbers, things have to be traceable all the way back to their source, and then all the way into the pharmacist's possession. They keep talking about extending that to the patient, individual patient, so that we would actually have to have a record of the lot number of drugs given to that particular patient. That isn't a requirement yet, but it is being considered as far as the track and trace legislation. It seems to be getting more and more rigorous. I did mention earlier that there is a UGA College of Pharmacy connection. They did the first International Good Manufacturing Practices conference many years ago. They still do it. It is the largest CE meeting by the College of Pharmacy. People come literally from all over the world. It was so successful that some other people have duplicated that. There's actually 3 or 4 GMP conferences now nationally every year, but the one in Athens is still one of the biggest ones they have. Cover just a few more parts of this, and then we'll stop for today. Again, this goes all the way back to that Pure Food and Drug Act. It was kept in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act when it was updated. The first things that were actually regulated on a national basis had to do with the adulteration and misbranding of drug products. Remember, until that Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act actually required the safety of those products, the only thing you had to prove they were not adulterated and they were not misbranded. There's always some questions on our exams. There'll be some questions on the MPJE about what is an adulterated scenario, what's a misbranded scenario. Very often they are both adulterated and misbranded. A lot easier to come up with something that covers both of those, but do be able to distinguish that. The key thing here, and I changed these today to blue to match Dr. Mishra's big bold blue from last semester. Adulterated products, that means there's something wrong with an ingredient or integrity of the ingredient. Either a product's in there or not in there that's supposed to be in there, or there's some contamination. I said adulteration, but I don't use the same word. There's something, the machine was breaking down, there's little pieces, shards of metal in there, or they were held in unsanitary conditions, and things that come up frequently are insect parts or rodent hairs or things like that in the product. That's definitely an adulterated product. Okay? Misbranding has to do with labeling. Again, it can be things that are left off the label. It could be things that are stated on the label or in there that aren't in there. All those types of things are misbranded products. One of the easiest ways that comes into practice of an adulterated product, we'll talk about this when we get to the Georgia regulations specifically, is if your pharmacy, hospital or community practice, whatever, ever has a fire or some other kind of chemical contamination in the area, all the products that are stored in that area are considered adulterated until proven not adulterated, okay? So most frequent time that comes into play is when a drugstore has a fire, and again, that smoke, gets into everything. You have to report that to the Georgia board. The GD&A will come inspect the facility. But the first thing is that you can't dispense anything out of that pharmacy, because everything is suspect until it's proven that it was not adulterated. So until the GD&A comes and passes judgment, tells you can open up or give out these drugs that you've even already prepared for dispensing to patients, nothing can go out of the pharmacy. Okay? So that's one of the most frequent areas we get involved in as far as adulterated products. Otherwise, it has to do with drug recalls, things like that. Oh my gosh, the phone calls that all of us have handled in the last few months as far as patients on Diavan or Valsartan generics. That had to do with adulterated products, some chemical contaminants that weren't listed or approved to be in those products. And it really shows you how this generic market is set up. You heard about one brand of generic that was considered adulterated. Next thing you know, there were like 6 or 7 or 8 others. Turns out they're all made in the same manufacturing facility. They were just made for this company or that company, but they all went through the same process and were all contaminated by the same products. So again, as old as that is, the concept of adulterated misbranded is still important today. I've put a couple of links on here if you want to get a chance to take a look at those. It does talk about some, this last one here is about I can hardly read that. I think that if you just click on them, it'll take you to those. But this has to do with a compounding pharmacy that was selling drugs that were misbranded, and this person had not only fines, but 10 years of imprisonment based on that. So again, some interesting things. This happened a few years ago. These were some OTC medications made by a major manufacturer in a plant. This happened to be in Puerto Rico, and they found that there was contamination of these liquid OTC medications. It ended up taking all of these off the market. So these things do still happen. And again, it goes back to some of that earliest legislation. Let's see, labeling requirements. Let's see where we are here. Let's pick up there next time. We'll talk about labeling because we've got quite a few things to go into on that. So let's go ahead and stop there today, and we'll pick up with this on Tuesday. And we'll try to get through this section probably by next Thursday, and we'll get into the next set of notes. And only a little bit into that set of notes before we cut off for the first exam. Get close to all that material there. But let me know if you have questions. Again, I've repeated some things, trying to emphasize those most important points. So kind of take that as areas we want to concentrate on for our exam, but also things that are more likely to show up in PJE. And we'll press on with other things next time. All right. Have a good week.
I was going to go. I mean, that's true. All right. I'm in